The Lapérouse anchor is one of the most important objects in Australia maritime history. This unique maritime fossil holds so many intriguing stories, from political and scientific ambition, exploration, but also of terrible tragedy and ensuing mystery. So why is this object so important? Why have it in a museum collection? So let's go on a bit of a journey to uncover its long, fascinating and turbulent history. To begin with, the shape and appearance of this anchor tells us a great deal about the ship it was from and how it was used. To tell us more, here is Dr. James Hunter.
So this is an old pattern long-shanked Admiralty anchor that was recovered from the shipwreck of L'Astrolabe in Vanikoro. It's a French-built anchor, and we know that because where these two arms joined was called the crown. And on British anchors, it forms a very noticeable V shape. French designed and manufactured anchors, by contrast, have a bit of an angle so that they look a little bit more like this. Now, anchors in the 18th century were manufactured in foundries. And what they did was they used industrial scale trip hammers, because these are manufactured from wrought iron. That's iron that was melted down into a molten state and was pounded repeatedly, folded over, pounded again, folded over, pounded again. When these anchors corrode, you can see in places these really odd striations in the metal. And what that is that's the layers of wrought iron. The other really interesting bit about this anchor I find quite fascinating is that the shank is not straight. It looks straight, but if you actually take a really good long hard look at it, you'll notice that there is a slight distortion to the shank as it moves away from the arms. And I believe that was caused by the wrecking event. It's very likely that this anchor was deployed in an effort to keep the ship from wrecking, but that the strain of the ship being forced by wind and waves, and ultimately when it struck the reef, may have caused the shank to bend and distort under the pressure of that wrecking event.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
So now we know what the anchor's design was intended for and how it was used. The question is, who did it belong to? The anchor's long been known as the anchor of Lapérouse. Lapérouse was a highly recognized French naval officer who was appointed by the then doomed King Louis XVI to undertake a global voyage of political and scientific discovery. So Lapérouse was the first European to chart areas of Europe, North America, Alaska, and even Russia. And while in Russia during his voyage, he got news from the king that there was a fleet of ships heading from Great Britain towards Australia. So Lapérouse and his 220 men and his two ships, the L'Astrolabe and La Boussole, turned south through the Pacific. Lapérouse and his men shored up on this very area on Aboriginal land where the museum now stands and took some rest before heading off in March 1788 into the Pacific, aiming to return home back to France in 1789. Unfortunately, he was never seen again. In 1791, the Assembly sent out another expedition led by d'Entrecasteaux to try to find out what had happened to Lapérouse. Unfortunately, that expedition wasn't successful. That was until in 1826 there was a new discovery that played a really important part in this whole story. And this little beautiful object, a replica French sword hilt, tells an important part of that story. In 1826, an Irish mercenary, Peter Dillon, was travelling through the Pacific and landed on the island of Tikopia. And there he met some First Nations people who had in their possession some French and European military objects, including this sword hilt. Dillon was intrigued by this and asked where they'd found them, and they told them that they had come across some shipwrecked people several years earlier on the island of Vanikoro. Dillon put two and two together and realised he had probably solved the great mystery of Lapérouse. At the same time, down in Tasmania, another great French explorer, de Mondeville, had heard news of Dylan's discovery and headed up to Vanikoro to try to confirm it both for himself and for his country. Peering over the side of his own ship, Deville looked and saw the sprawling wreck of what was obviously a shipwreck with cannons and anchors across Vanikoro's reef, eerily in the shape of a large ship, and Deville realised he was looking at the wreck and the final resting place of both l'Astrolabe and La Boussole. At last, France could put the mystery to bed and move on to more pressing matters like revolutions at home. Many years later, in 1958, an intrepid New Zealand scuba diver called Rhys Discombe partnered with the French Navy to undertake a series of salvage operations on the two wrecks of the Lapérouse expedition. Our own anchor, the Lapérouse anchor, was salvaged in 1959 on the Discombe expedition on the Lapérouse site. A few years later, Discombe also played a major role in identifying the wreck site of Lapérouse's largest ship, La Boussole. La Boussole had gone down on the outer sheer reef at Vanikoro, and one of the great mysteries of this tragedy is how the two ships came to be lying so close to each other. And one very compelling and poignant theory is that the crew of the l'Astrolabe saw their friends on La Boussole in terrible danger, and to try to save them, they turned l'Astrolabe towards the coast in order to launch a rescue mission. But unfortunately, the fringing reef was far too narrow, and l'Astrolabe became smashed to pieces on the inner reef. And there's a reason now why that area of Vanikoro is now called the False Passage. In 1964, as a gesture of friendship between the French and Australian governments, the anchor was brought over to Australia on the French naval ship L'Orientaise under the care of Captain Baudin. It was displayed here at the Lapérouse headland where Lapérouse was last seen alive, until sadly it was vandalised in 1971. The replica anchor in the museum is its substitute, while the original anchor undergoes careful conservation work in eventuality for its return to the museum for long-term display. The Lapérouse anchor has great significance to the French community and people of France, and here is Madame Anne Boyon, Consul de France, to talk about what it means to the French people.
Lapérouse is one of the most brilliant and tragic figure of the 18th century Pacific exploration, and the biggest one that was led by France at this time. What I love with this anchor is I think this is an anchor that really symbolizes the fact that the French community in Sydney is anchored in Randwick. And of course there is this neighborhood which is called Lapérouse, there is this museum called Lapérouse, and we have the chance to have the French school in Maroubra. So I think there will be a lot of things to do together, and really this is the spirit of enlightenment, the spirit of scientific discovery, and the spirit of adventure. And it's a dream, and I think we have to share this dream together, France and Australia.
Merci beaucoup, Anne.
Merci à vous, chère Roxane, ce fut un plaisir comme toujours.
So there we are, 230 years of history and drama, all wrapped up into this astonishing maritime fossil. The Lapérouse anchor is important because of all the hands and lives connected with it. Those that forged it in the great foundries of 18th century France, those that hauled it on and off the bow of l'Astrolabe, those who rediscovered it, sketched it, and salvaged it, and those that brought it to Australia and who now care for it into the future. And the Lapérouse anchor also reminds us of the power of museum collections and their objects, endless sources of stories that keep surprising us now and well into the future.
We are gathered unveiling a very historic monument. It is a symbol of nearly 200 years of French pilgrimage and connection to our city to Lapérouse, to this particular special place on our continent.
It had been painted over the years and that paint was holding in corrosion, so our task basically was to get back to solid metal. And that's what a major part of this was. It is so special to see it back here in the home where it belongs, where it first dropped anchor in 1788.
Hopefully here we will be able to prolong it at the Perouse Museum, and through ongoing conservation make sure that many generations will be able to enjoy it.
And having this anchor returning here at the point where it once made its final stop. This is the most significant embodiment of this friendship and this bond. This anchor is not just an antique joining other antiques. It is part of a dream finally finding its way home.